All right, thanks everyone for joining today. Our webinar on cloud compliance, picking a framework and simplifying your approach. As you see, we have a little poll up there to get started. So if you haven't had a chance, jump in there and let us know. We'll try and do another poll throughout, so just keep an eye out for it. Thanks again for joining. My name is Stephen Marshowitz. I'm the Director of Program Development here at TrustedSec. And basically, we wanted to come together with this webinar for you since we've seen actually a lot of interest in how we're going to comply in the cloud. So first, a couple of housekeeping items. The webinar will be recorded. And if you go back and you're able to see it on YouTube, study it, we'll send it out with an email to you as well. I don't know if you can get the presentation going or if you want to stop the vote so we can see what the vote is. All right. So great. If everyone can see that now, if you want to start the presentation, that would be great. What percentage of your organization is in the cloud? And so it looks like most of you, or for a good chunk of you, it's still less than 25, or still 41% have less than 25% of their organization in the cloud, which is interesting, and then pretty well mixed throughout. Only 4 folks have, out of the people, only 4 folks have, 76 to 100%. Some people are already 100% in the cloud. So that's great to see and interesting to note as we set this up. So again, we went through a couple of housekeeping items. Let me give you a little bit on TrustedSec. At TrustedSec, we start with the most challenging aspect of security, really understanding the real world effectiveness of your security program. And we try and do that with emulating what a skilled attacker, some of the nation states using cutting edge techniques. So our company was founded on that. When you look across the full life cycle of your security program, TrustedSec helps with building, testing, fixing, and responding. One second here as we get the slides to catch up. There we go. Okay, great. So building, testing, fixing your program, and then responding to any incidents. There are quite a few things in the building with risk programs, compliance, and readiness assessments. Testing is not only penetration testing, but cloud platform testing as well. So that's something to be familiar with as we talk through this, and also customized testing, which has been quite popular lately. And then fixing, remediation and assistance and training. Those are the things that really where, we always say if you know what you're doing, it takes you 3 days. If you don't know what you're doing, it takes you 3 months. So sometimes you just need a little help with your program, getting a few things started. So we go with that and definitely try and help you out. And then lastly, if there is a problem within the program, you have an incident, we have an incident response and forensics unit as well. Okay. There we go. Okay. So I have a little challenge with the slides today. So here's a bunch of our services that we offer, and one to just pull out that's been very popular right now is Ransomware Resilience. Ransomware is on the top of everyone's tongue, tip of everyone's tongue right now. So we have an offering in and around that where we'll review your capabilities from various perspectives, including your business needs and requirements, data classification, business continuity, cyber insurance, crisis communication, as well as some of the technical areas with identity and access management, incident response, and threat management. And these can also actually be paired with a defensive backup review. So a deep dive with the remediation team on your backup architecture. And then also we can validate the infrastructure using adversarial simulations and techniques that those ransomware groups use. So something, if you're interested in, definitely reach out and we'll be able to get back to you. Okay, great. On to our speakers today. Hopefully this works now. We have one more slide. There we go. So we have 2 senior speakers for you today from our advisory team, Chris Camejo from Parts Unknown and Jonathan White from Parts Known. Chris, go ahead, take it away.
All right, thanks. So yeah, I'm Chris Camejo with Trusted Sec. I've been doing pen testing and PCI compliance and all sorts of other various compliance things for about 20 years now. And yeah, speaker at DEF CON and Black Hat and all these fun conferences, doing all sorts of research behind the scenes and finding new security vulnerabilities and all that fun stuff. To you, John.
Yes, hi everyone. As you can see, my name is Jonathan White, and I'm a senior security consultant here at Trusted Sec for the past 4 years. I've worked pretty much entirely as a member of the advisory GRC team, focusing primarily in the PCI arena, until recently, where I handle a lot of the areas of assessing customers' security postures against various compliance frameworks such as NIST, CSF, 800-53, as well as ISO. And prior to working for Trusted Sec, I used to work as a facilitator between company resources and an external third party, helping to facilitate the annual SOC 2 audit. Chris and I are really looking forward to providing you with some good tidbits and takeaways as it relates to cloud compliance today. Let's start off with some general cloud benefits. I don't want to take for granted that we're not necessarily, just jumping into some of the gotchas. When it comes to security and compliance, which by the way, they are not the same thing, we need to be concerned about the process, the people, and the technology. But before we get into some of the gotchas, as I mentioned, the things that make you go, let's talk about some of the benefits of the cloud. First, there's cost savings. Everyone knows that migrating to the cloud can reduce IT complexity as well as costs. There's also the benefit of newer technology. Cloud service providers often provide access to a greater range of newer and more advanced technologies. We also have additional knowledge. By migrating to a cloud solution, a company can pretty much leverage the skills and the knowledge that the cloud service providers personnel have. As for high availability and redundancy, cloud service providers often have redundant locations, whereas your particular company may not. General cloud concerns. Oops, forgive me. One of the best things or the most important things is that there may be a loss. No, there is more or less going to be a loss of control of the environment, which pretty much speaks for itself. You're basically turning over the control, but not necessarily the responsibility to a third party, which we'll talk about a lot later. You also have loss of visibility and ongoing security measures. In many cases, security is taken out of the hands of the customer. There will be a loss of visibility in the cloud provider's security stack, while keeping in mind that companies want the level of security to be equal to or better than their own. Continuous monitoring of compliance standards is definitely a best practice. And prior to moving to the cloud, a company would have had 100% of this capability. But now that our processing is in the cloud, we have to rely on receiving annual reports on compliance from the cloud service provider. There's, of course, the loss of data center access. Without the visibility inside the provider's data center, we basically have no way of knowing when they may be out of compliance in between their reporting periods. I'll turn it over to you, Chris.
Thank you. So, yep, our slides are jumping all over the place. So one of the big concerns here is when you have an information security program that doesn't align with the cloud, and in a traditional model, most organizations should have a set of information security policies and procedures, standards designed around usually the traditional operating model where you control your hardware and your operating systems, your software, your personnel. You've got all this infrastructure that you've written policies and procedures and standards for. You can access the facility facilities themselves. You can control things like physical security. And at the end of the day, you know where your data is. It's in your data center, your offices. So when you move to the cloud, all of that changes. And we see pretty frequently just this idea of like, oh, we're going to come up with a cloud policy and that solves everything. And typically it doesn't. You're just slapping a Band-Aid on it, because when you move to the cloud, you're affecting basically every single one of these areas. Depending on the type of cloud service you're operating, most of the time you definitely won't control the hardware or have physical access to the facility. Depending on the type of service, maybe you have control of the operating system, maybe you don't. Maybe you have control of the software, maybe you don't. And your personnel may have some access, but typically there will be third-party personnel as well. And you almost never know where the data is. It's just, that's the whole point. It's out there in the cloud somewhere. It's a magical place where the data goes. So just coming up with a cloud policy usually isn't enough. When you go into the cloud in a big way, this affects nearly every part of your information security program. And that brings us into the responsibilities. If you're dealing with compliance requirements or other frameworks, there are a lot of different things that you're supposed to do. The list on the right here, we don't need to go through that in detail, but just all these day-to-day things that you need to manage as part of your information security program. And one of the big problems moving to the cloud is figuring out who has those responsibilities. And it's typically a sliding scale, as you see across the bottom, going from something like a private cloud, which is pretty close to what you would have on-prem, all the way over to software as a service, where it's typically turnkey. But just to pick on a particular thing like backups, is that cloud provider doing backups? How quickly can they restore them? What sort of resiliency program do they have in place? So these are all things that if you were doing it in-house, you would know exactly how that's all set up and what to expect. You may not know what's going on if you're in a complete software as a service environment. So as you move this slider on what type of cloud service you're investing in, you really have to think about these responsibilities and whether it's something that you need to be doing and thinking about, or whether it's something that your provider needs to be doing and thinking about, that you need to chase them down and figure out exactly what it is that they're doing for you and what to expect at the end of the day. And make sure that none of these are overlooked. That's the really big hazard of all this, is some important responsibility gets overlooked because you thought the cloud provider was doing it, and buried somewhere in the fine print of their contract, it says that you're responsible for doing it. And the worst case scenario is when we have what we call shadow IT. Basically, somebody in the organization goes outside of the normal IT processes and says, hey, typical example we see, somebody says, hey, I need to share this file with a partner, a vendor, a customer, and for whatever reason, it's too big to email, and I just need to get this out the door. So they sign up for like Google Drive or Dropbox or one of these free cloud services and start sharing this information that may be sensitive information. Once that happens, you've lost all control of your data. IT is no longer involved. This is basically an employee has effectively gone rogue within your organization, is now running their own IT. So all of those things that I just talked about with responsibilities and who's taking care of backups and who's responsible for user management. Bob down in the sales department is now in charge of all those things, and IT has no idea that any of it's happening. So this is a real big hazard with cloud, is it's become easier for people to access and just sort of spin up their own little shadow IT instances that real IT has no idea about. So next we want to get into, I think we have another poll to bring up here about some of the different frameworks that we're looking at. And yep, there we go. And so the frameworks in the poll are more kind of voluntary frameworks, things that you can sign up for that will help you increase your cloud security. There's also a whole bunch of different compliance requirements out there that you're required to do based on the type of data you're handling. So these are some of the big ones. Obviously, there's more. There are a lot of privacy requirements in here, things like CCPA, GDPR. You've got things that are related to the type of data you handle, Hipaa having to do with healthcare information, Pci Dss if you're dealing with credit card data or payment card data. depending on who you're contracting with. So things like DFARS and Fedramp, if you're doing things with the federal government, Department of Defense. So there's a whole bunch of different things out here that, depending on what you're doing and what you're handling, you've got a lot of different things potentially in play. And all of these have, to some extent, have some overlap with each other. So, and then they all have certain cloud aspects to them as well. So there's a lot going on here. Looking at the poll results, it looks like a lot of people are looking at NIST CSF and the CIS controls. So no surprise there. And ISO's in a very close third place. Those two were tied for first, and ISO is very close behind. So that doesn't really surprise me much at all. Just that's pretty much what we're seeing across the board.
Yeah, you mean what used to be CIS top 20 that's now 18?
Yeah. And something else to think about as you go through some of these different compliance requirements is there's add-ons and frameworks in addition to the compliance requirements. So ISO 27001 is a pretty popular one that people have been using for information security for quite a while. There are now add-ons, ISO 27017, specific for, it's basically the cloud security add-on to ISO 27001. And 27018 is the cloud privacy add-on to ISO 27001. So there's, and see if I get the number right, it's 27007, I believe, is the regular privacy add-on for 27001. So this is kind of the cloud equivalent to that. So if you're handling data in the cloud, now you've got additional ISO requirements that come into play. Fedramp, same thing on the federal side. If you're doing anything with, if you're a federal agency doing anything with the cloud, Fedramp comes in to basically extend NIST 800-53 with some cloud-specific requirements. And even if you're not a federal agency, NIST 800-53, we've seen a lot of organizations use that just as a good framework. It's a little more detailed than things like NIST CSF. So if you want to kind of take that next step beyond CSF, we've seen a lot of private organizations that are just using 853 as a framework. So Fedramp is potentially another great step for those organizations to use to kind of extend 800-53 into the cloud. I hand it back over to you, Jonathan.
All right, thanks, Chris. Yeah, just basically because the cloud is so popular now, there are some cloud-specific frameworks that are coming to light, or the add-ons like Chris was talking about. There's some of them that are available that help to provide clarity on the information security that can be applied to the cloud framework, such as the ones that are listed on your screen. One is CSA, or the Cloud Security Alliance, which does have a certification program for cloud providers. There are questionnaires that are already available that cover common topics such as audit and assurance, application and infrastructure security, business continuity, to name a few. And then you have MITRE, which is a great tool to use as a knowledge base for cybersecurity behavior. MITRE has information specific to particular types of businesses and the operating security platforms that are known to be particular targets. So also, in addition to that, MITRE has also provided a threat intelligence framework specific to the cloud. Back over to you, Chris.
All right. So we've got a few cloud compliance gotchas here. In some of these, we'll be diving into specific compliance requirements. But this first one's just pretty broadly applicable, is that a lot of cloud services, when you go on the website and you're looking at what their service offerings, and they give you this big full featured, we take care of all these amazing things for you, and it's completely turnkey, and it sounds absolutely great. But then as soon as you start asking questions about, okay, well, we're planning on storing, say, cardholder data, credit card data in this cloud instance, or we have Hipaa compliance requirements, or whatever may be in play there, suddenly things start coming off. You find out that, oh yes, we do have a PCI compliant version, or we have a Hipaa compliant version, but a lot of those features and things that the cloud provider would be handling for you, suddenly they're not handling anymore. And usually what that means is the cloud provider isn't certified, or their personnel or some of their processes aren't up to the standard that the compliance requirements call for. So what they're doing there is they push those responsibilities back on you. And this goes back to that sliding scale I talked about earlier with, depending on the type of service, some of those responsibilities may be more or less yours. So we've seen that where when you start getting into the quote compliant version of a service, they push those responsibilities back on the customer. And what you thought was going to be this nice turnkey service turns out that you actually have to invest quite a bit of time and effort into building up your own processes around this cloud service to basically support the compliance of this service. You know, they're giving you the bare bones framework, and it's up to you to implement the compliant processes around it. So that's something to look into as you're looking at cloud providers. Again, read the fine print in those contracts and see who's got those responsibilities, and make sure you talk up front about PCI compliance or HIPAA compliance, whatever else it may be, and make sure that the service you're getting is the quote unquote compliant version, and you know what your responsibilities will be.
Yes.
And an example of this is when you're talking about PCI in particular, PCI calls for penetration tests. And there's some guidance here that on the right side that PCI puts out about penetration tests. And you can see that it's talking about third parties. Typically, the third party should be doing these penetration tests on their own infrastructure and should be saying, yep, we've done these PCI compliant tests and everything's fine. But what if your third party cloud provider hasn't done this or is not willing to share this with you? Now you've got compliance issues of your own. Digging into some of the PCI requirements, it's on you to monitor the compliance of any service provider that you're using for storing cardholder or payment card data. So this is a potential gotcha when you've got an organization that's saying, you know, hey, yeah, of course we're PCI compliant. Trust us. Yeah, everything's great here. That doesn't necessarily always cut it in the PCI world. So you have to pay attention to what these requirements are and what the cloud provider is doing for you, and what they'll let you do. Whether they will let you pen test their infrastructure or not is a whole nother conversation that you may need to have with them if you're going down this road. To you, Jonathan.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Yeah, on this slide we have compliance verification, and basically we have a couple of boxes of areas that need to be basically verified. For instance, tenant separation. When you're in a SaaS environment and you're sharing space with other customers, we need to make sure that, for instance, your information is not shared with another company's information. You have, of course, the areas of physical security, as well as vulnerability management and incident response. I mentioned earlier about having to rely on a cloud service provider's annual compliance reports as sort of an attestation that they are doing what they're supposed to do. But don't just get the compliance report from the third party, but actually read the report. Make sure that they're covering the controls that are relevant to your organization, and make sure that they don't have any gaps that may be of particular concern to your company. To the extent possible, we should try to verify how they carry out these responsibilities that are listed here. We should ask questions like, are they compatible with our company's compliance requirements? Are they compatible with our risk tolerance? So basically, like Chris said earlier, there's a lot of things that, you need to confirm, and it should be done at the point prior to signing the actual contract. Back at you, Chris.
Something else to think about is the perimeter of the environment. So again, picking on PCI a little bit here, you've got these two requirements about prohibiting direct public access to a system that has cardholder data, and also implementing a DMZ for any information coming in and out from the internet to your systems. And in a traditional network environment, like this is easy to do. You've got your DMZ set up, you've got your internal networks, you can set up some sort of a portal in your DMZ that transfers the information back to the inside of your network where the databases live. So that's the world we're used to living in. When you get into the cloud, things start to get really weird, and we've seen a lot of this with things like you can just spin up a database instance on some of Microsoft's cloud services, and these things tend to just be out there on the internet. So you're just relying on Microsoft security. And when that fits your risk profile, that's okay. But when you start getting into compliance like this, you've now got these two big PCI requirements here, and there's equivalent requirements in some of the other standards that make that a little bit difficult to do. How are you going to prohibit direct public access to a database in the cloud? Do you have the ability to put some sort of firewall, cloud-based firewall that database off, and then have that same sort of portal model where you've effectively got a cloud DMZ and then a cloud internal network with all of the controls and separation between them that you would normally have on your internal network? So that's something we've run into. We've had clients that have this issue where we talk through how their architecture is set up, especially for 100% cloud-based clients. And the answer is just like, yep, it's all out there in Azure or AWS or wherever it happens to be, and you can hit it from anywhere on the internet. And it's just because it's in the cloud doesn't mean these requirements don't apply anymore. So you still have to think in terms of a traditional network architecture, even when you've got these things up hosted in the cloud. To you, Jonathan.
And you mentioned Azure, which I found to be pretty cool because they actually have some PCI specific controls within their cloud provided service. I don't know if they're optional, as in extra money, but they definitely are there. Bear with me. So pretty much, let's talk briefly again about PCI, which I know everybody on the line is getting excited because it's such an exciting topic to talk about. But basically, at a basic level, Pci Dss asks the question, is there payment card data being processed, transmitted, and stored across your environment? And this doesn't matter whether it's being done or in-house. And we said it numerous times, but we cannot stress enough that the responsibility between your company and the service provider for managing security controls does not exempt your company from the responsibility of ensuring that cardholder data is properly secured. So, that's one of the misconceptions about going to the cloud. It's like, once I go to the cloud, okay, I no longer have to handle responsibilities here in-house. And that's so far from the truth. This slide here is a PCI DSS responsibility matrix. And one thing that I really want to point out to you that shows on this slide is that there's way more gray areas than there are any other color, which basically means that the gray areas could be either the responsibility of the company or the responsibility of the cloud service provider. Keep in mind, we keep stressing the same things over and over again, that these responsibilities need to be made clear during the contractual phase, not once you sign up. Another reality is, for that you can see from the chart, is that the customer will always have some sort of responsibility in the area of access control, as in requirement 8 that's listed here for PCI. You won't be able to get away from that, because basically it's going to be the company who knows if there's new hires or if there's terminated employees that need to either be granted access or access taken away. That's something that the cloud service provider cannot provide for you. Take it. You can take it, Chris.
So moving away from PCI finally, you can tell both of us work in the PCI world too much, but let's switch it up here. So another example here from CMMC, and for anybody who's not familiar, this is actually a really new compliance requirement that has to do with defense contractors. Basically protecting all the kind of technical blueprints and things for people who are making things for the defense industry. And you get into some sort of weird interpretations here on these things. So one of the CMMC requirements says you have to monitor and control remote access sessions. And in the traditional network context, that VPNs, you've got somebody coming in from a remote office or coming in from home, so you give them a VPN, that's the remote access session, you monitor it, you control who has access to it, you firewall it, all those things, and we've met this requirement, right? The problem is when you start reading into the discussion within the CMMC standard, you see this, the highlighted part in red here, that talks about access to cloud-based email providers or server infrastructures are also relevant. So what this is saying is kind of my point earlier about, yeah, we just put our database up in Azure. Well, you're going across the internet to hit that database, even if you're coming from your internal network. So technically that's remote access. You are remotely accessing that database across the internet from your internal network. So now you have a whole bunch of requirements that used to just apply to people coming in work from home situations that apply to basically your core infrastructure because you've chosen to put a part of that core infrastructure in the cloud. So now you've got potentially things like site-to-site VPNs in play from your core network out to your cloud infrastructure to try to secure that and set up the same level of monitoring and control that you would have for somebody doing a remote office work from home sort of situation. So not what people would typically expect. And so this is a really good example of just in general, when you read through some of these compliance requirements, you have to pay very close attention to the wording of the control and the wording of some of the additional guidance around these requirements, because there are definitely some gotchas in there that you might not expect at first glance spinning through these things. And so this is something to think about when you're, again, choosing your cloud provider. Are you able to set up site-to-site VPNs to the cloud provider? Are you able to set up client VPNs if you just have workstations that need to access this? You can very quickly get into sort of mixed environments where, sticking with my example of you've moved some critical application up to the cloud, you may have the traditional day-to-day access coming from your internal network to that cloud instance that you can do with a site-to-site VPN. But what are you going to do now about your remote workers? Somebody who's working from home needs to also access that application. Are they going to be doing remote access straight to the cloud? In which case you would also have to monitor and control that. So are you going to allow client VPNs up to the cloud, or are you going to require those remote workers to VPN into your office network, your internal network, and then sort of redirect, bounce through your internal network to then go through that site-to-site VPN to the cloud? So there are some architecture considerations to think about here as you go through this and start designing this and figuring out how you're going to meet some of these compliance requirements. And then we get into the data location. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Picking on GDPR here, GDPR is very picky about where information is located. And this particular requirement says that you have to provide your data subject. So that's basically the person whose data you have in your database. You have to provide the data subject with information that includes whether you're going to transfer that personal data to a third country or an international organization. In this context, international organization does not mean Google or Microsoft or Amazon. That means something along the lines of like the United Nations or the Red Cross or a big like non-governmental organization. So what this is telling us is that, let's say you have some information that's covered by GDPR and you decide to put it up in the cloud. You need to know what country your cloud provider is keeping that data in. And if they just have this big amorphous cloud where it goes into the magic cloud and who knows where it gets routed after that, you may not be able to meet this requirement. Some cloud providers will have that option where you can say, US only. You can choose to keep that data in a particular jurisdiction. So that's something to think about in this context here as well. A good example of this would be, and a lot of companies may think, oh, I don't really have any GDPR responsibilities, but think about your HR. A lot of organizations are going to their HR platforms in the cloud or CRM systems. Now you've got information about your customers. And if you're including some of those data elements that are covered by GDPR, and some of those people are European residents, now you're in play. Even though your core business may not be handling personal data, your CRM system or your HR system have now put you into the GDPR world, and you have to think about where that data is going. So when you think about jurisdiction, number one, the where is it problem that we just talked about, and is that compatible with your compliance requirements? And you also have to think about the local laws. So things are getting very interesting, potentially in a bad way right now with some countries. Russia's doing this, China's doing some of this, where the Russia situation is kind of the shining example of this, where there's all sorts of rules about if you have data about Russian residents, the data must be located in Russia. So if you're doing something along those lines, now you've got, you have to make sure that that what you're doing is compliant there. You've got some encryption escrow laws. I believe China's got something like this on the books now, where if you're encrypting data in China, that data, you have to keep a set of decryption keys for the government. They can just request, yep, we need that decrypted. So now you've got this potentially conflict where you may have some compliance requirement that says, yep, you have to keep this data encrypted and not share it with anybody and keep it all locked down. That runs afoul of some other country's laws if that data ends up in that third country that says, well, you have to give us the encryption keys, and you have to reconcile those two issues. Different countries just have different legal systems that we have to work around. So definitely get your legal department involved as soon as you start looking at a cloud service where things are going to start crossing jurisdictional lines. And even beyond that, you've got some countries that may just abuse the legal process, subpoenas and things that are not really all that bona fide, that may start making requests for your data or certain things like that. So just a lot to think about there when you're choosing where it's going to go. And back to you, Jonathan.
All right, thanks a lot, Chris. Yeah, you mentioned GDPR, and which closely relates to this particular framework here, CCPA 1798.105. So, they specifically address how data should be handled as well as destroyed. As you see in the red here, a consumer should have the right to request that a business delete any personal information. Most organizations, if they're not, they should have steps in place to destroy the data on their own infrastructure. For instance, whether it's some sort of secure deleting mechanisms or degaussing of drives or some other means of physical destruction of storage devices. But the question comes to be, are the cloud providers taking these same steps when storage devices are either decommissioned, retired, or reassigned? The second paragraph that's in red talks about shall delete the consumer's personal information from its records and direct any service provider to delete the consumer's personal information from their records. So all of this comes into play again for the CCPA, but it also is very applicable for GDPR. And as Chris mentioned, you may not even know directly whether or not you're handling European Union information because you could be doing it indirectly without even thinking about it. So you definitely need to make sure that data is handled and destroyed in the proper manners. Back to you, Chris.
Yeah, so things to think about when you're talking to your cloud provider. What sort of secure delete options do they give you, if any? This is something that's not really, I haven't seen a lot of this in the cloud provider space where they're talking about this. And the particular scenario here is when instances move. So you've put data up in the cloud, obviously it's sitting on a server somewhere, even though you may not know where, but that cloud provider may be shifting instances around and just decide to move your data from this virtual machine to that virtual machine or whatever different locations and data centers. They could be moving your data around all over the place and you have no idea because it's a cloud service. From your perspective, it's seamless. And that's where this comes into play is, are there ghosts of your old data left on all these images out there? What happens when those instances move? Are they really going through and doing a secure delete, a secure wipe on the storage space that was assigned to your old instance when they've moved you to a new instance? Things like backup tapes, if they're backing up their own infrastructure, what are they, if you delete something from your instance, it's probably not getting deleted from the backups. So a lot to think about there. And even getting into what's your cloud provider doing with data that you don't even know that they're doing. So companies like Google that give all these free services, There's all the bits about how if you're using Gmail, like, yeah, Google's giving that for free because they want to be able to sift through that data and use it for advertising purposes.
Right.
So, a lot of people don't really think about that on a day-to-day basis, but those are things that are happening behind the scenes, and you could have data that's just moving to different places because of what your cloud provider is doing as part of their business model, that you're not even aware that that data is moving around or being aggregated or being sold. And again, you really have to dig into the fine print to figure out what's going on in some of these situations, dig into their privacy policies, things like that, terms of service. Back to you, Jonathan.
Okay, let's talk briefly about effective monitoring. We all know that the ability to monitor activity is a key part of detecting breaches, hopefully before any serious issues would occur. You have here ISO 27002, where it speaks about event logs should include when relevant, and I'm not going to read all of those to you, but I can tell you from personal experiences as well doing PCI audits that many of the types of instances that you should capture aren't always captured in the logs. Like for instance, you should be able to capture successful as well as unsuccessful login access. You should be able to capture the creation of accounts, but especially those accounts that have elevated privileges. You should capture when a regular user account, the privileges are elevated to some sort of a system or domain level type account. You should also capture things like account deletions. And in some cases, you should always capture any actions that are performed by an administrator. So if you don't have the visibility into what's going on in your cloud service provider's environment, you may not even realize that the environment has been compromised. So it's very important to make sure that in addition to capturing those certain instances, that there's certain information in those log captures, like for instance, the date and the time of the actual item that was captured, as well as tying it to a particular user ID so that you could do forensic investigation later if needed. Back to you, Chris.
And the last little bit on that at the bottom from CMMC is also the collecting that audit information into one or more central repositories, as CMMC says. So basically, this is talking about a SIM, for the most part. And so as you're going through this, you should think about when you're talking with your cloud provider, number one, what contents do these logs have? Does it have all of the different data elements you need? And does it capture all the different event types that you need for your compliance requirements or for your just risk profile? And what format is this in? So if you've got a SIM, are you able to set up the export from your cloud service so that it feeds the logs directly into your SIM so you can meet these centralization requirements so your SOC can monitor what's going on in the cloud? Or is the log just, oh yeah, it's in the console on the website and you can go scroll through them if you want to, which makes it really hard to stay on top of and monitor what's actually going on in that cloud instance. There's usually too many logs to go through it by hand. That's why we've invented SIMs. So just making sure that the logging and monitoring capabilities of your cloud instance are compatible with whatever it is that you're using internally to keep tabs on your network and what's going on. Retention is another issue. Different cloud requirements have different retention, or different compliance requirements have different retention. So PCI has the immediately accessible logs versus the long-term storage, making sure that your cloud provider has that capability, making sure that they're storing the logs for the amount of time that you need to meet those requirements, or just as long as you want to have them available. So if something happens, you can go rewind the clock and see what actually happened. And making sure that they can be exported to you in that usable feed format into your SIM.
Oh yeah, and Chris, I neglected to mention also there should be some sort of an alerting type feature on particular logs, because it's okay for it to go to a log, but if it's something serious, you want to make sure that someone is receiving that message.
And then the worst case scenario, when you have an incident, it shouldn't be this way, but a lot of companies, if there's an incident, they're looking out for number one. They're trying to protect their own business. So it is not always in a company's best interest to go running around telling everybody immediately when there's a breach or some other sort of security incident. And that can be an issue for us as well. Hipaa is the example here that Hipaa gives you a requirement that you have to notify everybody whose information was potentially compromised in a breach. And there's a hard deadline on this, without unreasonable delay, and in no case later than 60 calendar days. So this could really put you behind the curve if your cloud provider gets breached and they decide they're going to sit on it and investigate it and figure out what's actually going on before they tell anybody. You may not find out immediately that there even was a breach. And when you find out, it may turn out to be like, okay, now we're really short on our deadline. We have to tell our customers, our individuals whose information was potentially compromised, and we're running up against hard deadlines here. So now you don't really have much time left to react. There's been a lot of instances of major breaches where you see things come out where initially it's like, oh yeah, well, we've been breached, but only this small amount of records have been compromised. And then a week later, that number doubles. And then a week later, that number goes up by an order of magnitude. So these are the kinds of things we need to think about with cloud providers there's this long track record of major breaches and not being handled all that well, let's just say. Not necessarily specific to cloud, but just in general. And so now you're kind of relying on your cloud provider's incident response process and hoping that they're going to do the right thing and notify you in a timely manner of that breach. So things to think about there is looking through the contracts, the terms of service. What do they have as far as timelines on when they're going to notify you of things? Are you going to get a comprehensive disclosure of what's actually gone on, or are they just going to give you the bare minimum of, yeah, there was a breach, this stuff was stolen, we're not going to tell you how. And now you're kind of behind the curve in that you don't know what's actually going on and how to fix the problem, if you can even fix it. The cloud provider could just be sitting there saying, yeah, we fixed it, trust us. How does that factor into your breach notification obligations for your compliance standards? And then going back to the idea that shared responsibilities between your organization and the cloud service provider. If you detect an incident going on, let's say you've got those logs coming in, they're going to your SIM, you're getting alerts, your SOC is paying attention, and you see some suspicious activity, do you have that ability to coordinate with your cloud service provider? If you call them up and say, hey, yeah, we see something going on, it looks like this account might be compromised, it looks like this is happening, are they actually going to work with you to try to address that? Or is that just going to go into a generic help desk ticket that's going to get ignored for a few days? So, how quickly can you really expect them to work with you and fix some of these situations? And if the worst happens, what will they do to help you recover? Do they have backups? Do they have staff on standby that can help you get the systems back online? Let's say a bunch of data was deleted, something along those lines. And that doesn't even have to be a hacking situation. That could just be, the good old accidental, oops, I just dropped a whole table from the database. I hope we can get that restored. So what capability do they have to help you get that back online? Back to you, Jonathan.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Yeah, we're going to talk very briefly about identity access management, basically managing people, roles, and identities. I did touch on it already earlier, but, and I have not seen a cloud provider service that I've worked with in any of the engagements that didn't have some sort of a secure system for provisioning and managing identities for their users. But it's definitely something that you need to make sure that it has, that the system or that the service has some sort of functionality where you could manage those users. And it needs to be able to support not only simple resources or resources that maybe just, access for day-to-day reasons, but it also needs to support elevated user access. So, and be able to separate the two. Okay, so for the most part, I did again mention that it's more than likely going to be you, the customer's responsibility to manage those user IDs, because again, the service provider or the cloud service provider doesn't necessarily know whenever you hire a new person, need to elevate a person's privileges, or if a person is terminated from your organization and those credentials need to be removed.
Yeah, so to wrap up here, we've just got a little bit more about kind of making the decision. So kind of putting all this together into, you're looking at a cloud provider or you're thinking about moving something to the cloud. What's kind of the takeaway list here of what you need to think about as you make that decision of what you're going to do and to what extent and whether it's the right move for you or not. And Jonathan, I believe you're kicking this off.
Yeah, correct. You need to basically ask yourself, are you willing to give up control of your computing environment at the very basic level? I mean, that's what you need to ask, because transitioning to cloud computing involves pretty much that you're going to transfer most or all of the responsibility and control to the cloud provider over your information, as well as your system components, if it's an IaaS pretty much type situation. Not only are you giving up loss of control, but you're also giving up some loss of influence over decisions by moving to cloud service providers. Another point is SLAs, service level agreements. You have to ensure that service level agreements are in place and also have appropriate provisions for both security as well as privacy. In particular, the SLA must help maintain legal protection over your data. There's also responsibility ambiguity, which basically is the responsibility for security. We've mentioned this numerous times, can spread over both the cloud service provider as well as your organization. And vital parts of this defense can be left unguarded if you haven't determined upfront who's responsible for what. There's information isolation failures. We talked briefly about multi-tenant solutions, where we definitely want to make sure that my information is not inappropriately shared with another company's information, like in a SaaS type environment situation. And then there's also the potential for vendor lock. And this speaks to pretty much the dependency that your application or whatever may have on some of the proprietary services that a cloud service provider is providing. So, you know, basically, if you wanted to discontinue the contract with your cloud service provider and go to another one, how seamless is the portability of the applications and data to go to a particular other provider? So those are some of the concerns that you need to consider and that should assist you in helping to make the decision. Chris?
Yep. So some ways that you can look at this is taking a few different approaches to this. One of them is the compliance-based approach. Looking at the cloud provider, figuring out, are they capable of meeting your compliance obligations, your legal obligations, your contractual obligations. So this is really kind of getting the legal department involved and looking through all these different things that you have to do, looking through your contracts and figuring out, like, okay, here's what here's the responsibilities that we have to our customers, to the people whose data that we have in our databases, and to the governments and other jurisdictions that that we're working with. Figuring out how those compliance controls are going to be met in that cloud environment, if they can be met, and also thinking about the scope of a compliance assessment. So I'm going to pick on PCI again here, just going back to familiar territory. We talked about things like the penetration tests earlier, that when you move to that cloud environment, when you use any sort of third party, you've just broadened the scope of your compliance assessment. You've basically brought that third party into your compliance scope. And if that cloud provider is not certified for compliance on their own, you're potentially stuck assessing that third party as part of your compliance assessment. So what's that going to do for your organization as far as the time, expense, difficulty of meeting those compliance assessment requirements? So having a certified provider definitely helps in that regard, where if they've got, you know, picking on PCI or CMMC or some of these cloud certifications, If they've got those compliance requirements already handled and they can just turn around and say, yep, we're compliant, here's our certificate, that makes life a lot easier for you. So that's potentially a really big selling point, is making sure that you're working with a provider that has already handled the compliance obligations for you. Another way to think about this is the risk-based approach, looking at your own organizational risk assessment, what you're comfortable with, and looking at what the cloud provider has for history. Do they have a history of major breaches that they've suffered? What are they doing for past vulnerability responses? And this is something that I've seen in my role as a vulnerability researcher. Is I've had certain vulnerabilities that we've found and reported to the organizations responsible for that software, and they effectively just ignore it, or they try to sweep it under the rug and they say, oh, that's only theoretical, that would never work in the real world. And so then we have to, nope, here's the proof of concept, it really does work in the real world. And to some extent, they're just trying to save face. To some extent, they're trying to save the expense of having to fix things, quote, unnecessarily. They'd rather have their programmers working on the next feature release rather than fixing old bugs and vulnerabilities. So looking at their past reaction to security incidents and vulnerabilities can tell you a lot about how seriously that company takes security and what you can expect from them in the future. Are they going to allow you to do security testing on them? So forget PCI compliance and those pen test requirements. Can you just hire a company, somebody like TrustedSec, to just straight up go pen test that cloud provider and try to poke holes in them and see how strong their security is? And if they say, yeah, go right ahead, happens all the time, we don't care, that's usually a pretty good sign, that they're confident that what they're doing is pretty solid. And on the other hand, if they're all wishy-washy and yeah, no, we don't really allow that because of reasons, that can be a red flag. Looking at their program versus your program, which one's more mature? If you look at your own internal security program and it's an absolute mess for whatever reason, maybe you inherited something that was completely screwed up from the beginning, this is an opportunity to say, yeah, well, the cloud provider may not be perfect, but it's better than this mess that we have, so let's make that move. On the other hand, if you have a really mature security program, you might be better off keeping some of this stuff in-house where you can manage it under your nice, strong security program. And then you also have to think about the long term. Buyouts and things happen all the time. What happens if your cloud provider decides to change their business model? What happens if they get bought out by somebody? What happens if they just go out of business? Yep, nope, we didn't get the next round of venture capital funding. So yep, that's it. We lock the doors tomorrow and lay everybody off and turn off the servers. So these are things that happen. So just taking a look at your cloud provider and thinking like, is this something that we can be committed to for a long period of time? And what's our exit plan if something changes? If they just decide to double the price of their service, or they change from a per company license to a per seat license that just completely makes it unfeasible for you. So definitely always have an exit plan and factor that into your risk assessment. And then a cost-based approach, taking a look at things like the taco slide we had earlier, where you may have a full-featured regular service, and then they may take some of those features out for the compliance service, and they may actually sell you. The other way they do it is they'll say, oh yeah, well, here's our regular service, but if you want this service to be compliant, you have to buy this add-on or that add-on, and that costs extra money. So you may find out that the cost of that cloud service is a little bit higher than what you expected initially. Taking a look at those responsibilities that remain with your team. So you may think, oh yeah, if we outsource this to the cloud, here's all these things we don't have to do anymore, only to find out that, nope, yep, we still have to do all these things because our cloud provider isn't doing them for us. So all these costs that you thought you were going to save, you don't end up saving. You end up just spending more money on the cloud service. Even if you can outsource things, the cloud provider handles those responsibilities. You may have to change some of your internal processes, the way your servers operate, the way things connect. That potentially has costs as well. Any new security capabilities that you may have to implement to monitor that cloud environment may have cost. And you're also potentially sacrificing your ability to make changes quickly. When something's in-house, you have hands on it, you can do quick changes. in this outsourced world, you may be stuck with the cloud provider's timetables rather than what you can come up on your own, and they may have different priorities than you do. And picking on it again, the lock-in, the future migration path, that someday down the road, you may end up either of your own decision or because of changes at the cloud provider, you may end up having to migrate off that cloud platform, either to a different platform or back to your own infrastructure. And what does that look like? What is that going to cost if you have to make that move someday? Do you need to be setting aside a budget for the get off the cloud budget to make that move down the road and spin up all your own infrastructure again, whether that's unexpected or not? So, so lots of things to consider there. Jonathan, if you had anything to chime in on these.
No, Chris, excellent job. I guess we'll just go ahead and end it there and see if there's any additional questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. Great work. We do have a couple of questions, starting with the first one. Can you give an example of where a cloud service provider pushes responsibility back on the user in the case of a compliant version of their service?
So I can kick this one off. It's often not as black and white as that. It's not like you're getting a piece of paper that says, here's your responsibility. It's more kind of the reading in between the lines. When you look at the terms of service, so to pick on Jonathan's example, something like user management, their contract's not going to say user management is your responsibility. It's just not going to say that the cloud service provider is handling that responsibility. So it's really up to your organization to take a look at what needs to be done for any of your infrastructure and look through those terms of service and figure out, okay, which one of these things are the cloud providers saying that they're going to handle? And if it's not on their list, it's probably still in your list of responsibilities, or at least it should be.
And there's also the opportunity to try and generate some sort of responsibility matrix. I know I, did refer to one for PCI as it relates to SAS, PASS, IaaS. So you can refer to those and kind of get an idea where it's clearly the responsibility of the cloud service provider, or it's clearly the responsibility of the customer, but then everywhere else, it's something that, can be both.
Yeah, and
Okay.
both is unfortunately more often than not the answer. So to think about something like the user access, you may be handling the authentication and access for your users, but you also have a cloud provider that has their own support staff and admins who are administering the underlying server infrastructure in something like a SaaS environment. So so now you've got this single responsibility for user management, that you're handling part of it, the cloud provider's handling part of it for your people versus their people. So some of these responsibilities get split up in really weird ways that are kind of difficult to put into a very clear bucket.
It's very nebulous.
Can you hit on any of the upsides related to cloud versus traditional data center? Have tools like AWS, Artifact, Security Hub, Audit Manager, Inspector, and whatever Google and Azure equivalents might be, has anything that they're doing made compliance easier?
Yeah, so if you do it the right way, if you design with the cloud in mind, absolutely. It's ultimately a business decision. There's different ways of doing things. You can do it in-house, you can do it in the cloud. They each have pros and cons. I've certainly worked with companies that are 100% cloud-based. And it's kind of amazing working with these companies because of all the internal infrastructure that just doesn't exist. It's like magic. They just say, yep, we've got a firewall and there's a Wi-Fi access point behind the firewall, and all our workstations access to the Wi-Fi. And that's it. That's the entirety of their internal infrastructure. Everything else is in the cloud. So many IT responsibilities and things that you would normally have to manage your physical infrastructure and all that stuff. It just goes away like magic. So yeah, I know the whole point of this presentation was to talk about cloud concerns and compliance concerns. So we've been picking on a lot of the negative stuff, but that's not to say like run away screaming from the cloud. Like this is an awesome tool. And I'm glad we got that question, so we have a chance to say that. it can do amazing things, but just when you're playing in the compliance space, and I don't think we mentioned this at the beginning, a lot of these compliance standards were not written with cloud in mind. Some of these things were like PCI DSS was written in kind of the very beginning of the move to the cloud era. And sure, they've updated it over time, and they've added the little bits in like that CMMC slide where it talks about cloud-based email. But it's still almost like an afterthought, kind of like that, oh yeah, we'll just put together a cloud policy and we're covered. Some of the compliance standards are kind of feel like that a little bit, where they just sort of tack cloud on at the end. So that's where things can just get a little bit sticky, is that lack of clarity when you're trying to read through a list of standards that were not written with the cloud in mind and try to figure out how to apply it to what you're doing.
Okay, great. Last one as we wrap up here. Is the risk-based approach diminishing? Back to your, how do you make a decision? Is it diminishing with compliance and third-party requirements? In other words, are people having less of a choice in what they do in the cloud versus what they don't?
Yeah, so it's the short answer is no, because most of these compliance requirements that are out there require you to do a risk assessment. So PCI I know has that. I'm pretty sure CMMC does. ISO, like ISO 27001 is all about the risk assessment. Like it's, you read through the ISO 27001 standard, and basically it says, do a risk assessment and then choose which ISO 27002 controls you want to implement based on the results of your risk assessment. So that door is still very wide open to doing risk-based things. And it's, I've been in the compliance space for a while, and that's one of my pet peeves, is the organizations that just look to do the bare compliance minimum. There's, compliance does not equal security. The classic example that I use for this in the PCI world is PCI is concerned with credit card numbers, payment card numbers not getting stolen. So everything in that PCI standard is all about protecting the confidentiality of that data. PCI does not care at all about availability. You won't see anything in PCI telling you to back things up or have redundant systems or anything like that. So if your database full of credit card numbers goes offline, hey, it's perfectly PCI compliant because it's offline. You may be losing $1 million an hour because you can't do any business, but that's not a PCI problem. So that's where the risk assessment comes into play, is that losing $1 million an hour is potentially a very big risk for your business. So you want to have those backups and redundant systems and everything else. And that's what the risk assessment will tell you. And that's the argument for making sure you take the risk assessment requirements of these compliance standards, and just even compliance aside, just in general, doing your own risk assessment is a very important thing to do and to use to drive these decisions, so that you don't overlook something critical like that a compliance standard may not care about.
All right, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and really want to give a big shout out to Jonathan and Chris for doing a great job on this webinar, particularly around cloud, and especially as we're getting more and more interest in how people are approaching their compliance and regulatory requests. With that, we will wrap it up. And again, thanks everyone for joining, and look forward to seeing you the next time.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.